Today on the Ask BP podcast, we're talking about, is it better to buy a $30,000 property or a $100,000 property? Stay tuned.
You're listening to another BiggerPockets Ask BP podcast, where you'll hear short, direct answers to your biggest real estate questions. Submit your question today on Facebook, Twitter, or the BiggerPockets forums by using hashtag AskBP. And don't forget to pick up your copy of the Ultimate Beginner's Guide to Real Estate Investing and other great content when you sign up for your free account at BiggerPockets.com. With that, let's get to the show.
Hey, what is going on, everyone? My name is Brandon, and you are listening and or watching the Ask BP podcast, the show that comes to you once every weekday to answer your biggest burning real estate questions. Now, before we get into today's episode, I do want to give you a little preview or a little teaser of what's going to be changing about the Ask BP podcast. In fact, I'm not going to tell you too much, but at show 100, we're going to do something a little bit different. So stay tuned for that. I think you'll like it. It's going to be something very powerful and very cool here at BiggerPockets, and it's going to be awesome. So stay tuned for that. But on to today's show, where we're talking about, should I buy a $30,000 property or a $100,000 property? Now, the question actually comes from my friend who we'll call Jay, who lives in Indianapolis. And Jay is wondering what he should pursue. I mean, there are properties that you can buy in that area, anywhere in the Midwest, really. Or, I mean, I live on the West Coast, and I know neighborhoods you can buy $30,000 houses. In a lot of areas of the Midwest, you can buy properties for $30,000 or even less. I mean, he was telling me there's some for 12. So, he could pursue those properties. Now, he doesn't have a lot of money to get started, so is that the best avenue for him to get started? Maybe, maybe not. So he asked me that question, what would I do? And so we talked about it for about half hour, 45 minutes, about whether he should get into one versus the other, or maybe something in between. And this is kind of how our conversation ended up going. You see, $30,000 properties could be great. I mean, they could be fantastic. But most likely, there are definitely dangers that you got to watch out for. And let me try to get into why that is. But first, let me talk about, what does a $30,000 house look like? I mean, I don't live in the Midwest anymore, so maybe I'm a little bit off here, but typically $30,000 houses are going to need some work. They're going to be old. You're not going to buy a 2012, 3-bedroom, 2-bath house in the suburbs for $30,000. You're probably going to buy a 1907 house that maybe it doesn't need a lot of work. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but it probably isn't the most updated. The plumbing probably isn't modern. It's probably got cast iron still. The electrical might still have knob and tube. Now, any one of those things isn't necessarily a deal killer, but they can be dangerous, especially when you have a lot of those problems in one. With those older properties, you tend to have that. Now, I can speak from experience here. I once bought a house for, my cheapest was $16,000, but that was just mostly a flip or kind of a wholesale deal. Instead, I think my cheapest actual house that I ended up holding for a rental was $42,000. And now I call that property my hell house. I still own it today. And I call it my hell house because it's the only property I own that consistently, year after year, loses money. Now, why I don't sell that, it's another story we could get into some other day, but the property just continually loses money, even though it has everything fixed up in it. Here's the problem, though. The $30,000, or in my case, $42,000 house attracts a certain kind of tenant. I'm not saying they're bad tenants, but they attract a certain kind of tenant. That kind of tenant tends to move more often. And so here's the problem with that house that I have. It goes vacant every single year. No matter how good of screening we do, it goes vacant every single year. We've had 5 or maybe 6 now bad tenants in a row over the last 5 or 6 years. They look good on paper, but the house only attracts this certain type of person because it's an old house. It's got a lot of awkward things, a very small kitchen, and it just attracts the wrong type of people. We've had drug problems in there. We've had other issues. Another problem is the house, the layout is weird. It might be 3-bedroom, 2-bath, but it's got a weird layout that not every good family is going to be attracted to. And so we've had a lot of issues with that. So furthermore, because of the age of the house, every time, and the condition, I guess, when I bought it, every time we have a tenant turnover, it's several $1,000s, sometimes $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 to get it turned over. And part of that is we're actually improving the property every time. We're doing those capital expenditures, the CapEx that we talk about a lot here on BP. We're doing those things, fixing part of the roof here and replacing this part of the foundation over here. And every time there's like a little task that needs to be done. And the best time to do it is at a turnover. The problem is we're only making in cash flow at the end of every month, we're only making maybe $50 a month, maybe 100 if everything was perfect. But that 100 gets eaten up really quick. Imagine that every year, if we're going $100 a month in cash flow, it's $1,200 a year. However, every time there's a tenant turnover, it costs us $2,000. So you can see over time, we just keep losing money over and over and over. Now, yes, I'm paying the loan down a little bit, but furthermore, this house has caused me more stress than all of my other properties combined. There's one house, just problem after problem after problem because I bought a cheap house. Now, don't get me wrong. There are cases where it's a good idea to buy lower priced properties. In fact, the house I'm recording this in right now, my own personal house, was a low price property. I bought it and I fixed everything on it. I brought everything up to code and it's a wonderful house now. But that's because I did a lot of work to get it to that point. And still, when I move out of here and turn this into a rental, which I'm going to do very, very soon, actually like next month, I'm going to have to put several $1,000s into just fixing it up, getting it ready. That's just what you get with the lower priced homes. So just something to keep in mind. So the question was, should you buy a $30,000 house or a $100,000 house? Now, recently I bought a property in a nice town, a very nice town, a very high-end town, and they were originally asking around 100. They dropped their price a little bit, and it needed a little bit of work, but it was a late 70s house. And so I ended up buying it for $70,000, and I put $30,000 into it. Now, this house has copper plumbing and PEX plumbing, which is all modern. It has a modern electrical panel. It's got a newer roof. It's got a new foundation, a cement foundation. It's got everything in the house now, and then everything else cosmetic-wise we fixed. So now that house doesn't actually cash flow all that well, maybe $100 a month. But here's the interesting thing about that house. It's in a great town with great people. The tenants there will likely be there for years to come. People don't move in this town very often. People don't destroy the houses as often when they leave. Because the house was so nice and because it attracted such a nice family to be there, when they leave, they'll likely leave it in the same condition or better. I've got a number of those properties that are nicer and they do really, really well. Now, don't get me wrong here. I do buy lower income properties. In fact, my favorite property that I own is a 5-unit property in a very low income area. It's a 5-unit, but I love it because it gives me $1,000 a month in cash flow every single month. So I look at that and I've been thinking a lot about that lately. Why is that property so much better than my other properties? And the only thing I can kind of think of is the condition of the property itself. This condition of this property is so rock solid. Everything's been updated. Every time there's a tenant turnover, it doesn't cost me any money. And so even though that 5-unit maybe has a little bit higher turnover than I'd like, it doesn't cost me anything during those turnovers. So which is better? I mean, again, I'm not saying one is necessarily better. Obviously, you can see that I'm a little bit biased towards the nicer houses. Now, in the bottom line here, really though, the bottom line is going to be money. And what I mean by that is return on investment, what's it going to give you? That's the thing that matters most to me is what kind of return. If you can buy a $30,000 house that after all those expenses provides a good return, well, I don't see any reason not to do it. The problem is $30,000 houses tend to have a higher percentage of those issues that are going to go wrong with it. Like for example, a new water heater costs what? $500-$600 to get a plumber to come out and install a new water heater. Now, that $500 or $600 water heater is going to cost about the same whether the property is a $100,000 property or a $30,000 property. Same thing with a roof. The roof's going to cost what? $12,000, $8,000, $6,000 if it's small. That's going to be the same price on a $30,000 house and a $100,000 house, even a $200,000 house. And so the percentage that it costs to maintain these smaller houses, the capital expenditures, those big ticket items that come around every so often, they're going to cost about the same no matter what property you're at. However, with the higher end properties, hopefully they're going to last longer because the tenants will take better care of them. Hopefully the property's been updated better so they don't need to be done for a long time. And hopefully you've got more income to be able to cover that because you're renting for a higher amount. And so, there's people that sell properties for $20,000 or $30,000 or buy properties for $20,000 or $30,000. And then they assume, I'll plan for 10% for repairs. but they got to plan a lot more than 10% for repairs because the repairs are such a higher percentage. So really, when you're planning those CapEx thing, it might be better to plan out in terms of dollar amount, like $200 a month for capital expenditures, perhaps, over time versus saying 10% of the rent. Hope that makes sense a little bit. So again, is it better to buy 30,000 or 100,000? Really, for me, it comes down to the numbers. But I will say that I'm a much bigger fan of the $100,000 property or the $100,000 house than I am of the $30,000 house. It's a lot less stress, and it's a lot, easier to manage those kind of properties. And they usually, in the end of the day, provide a better return. One last point I'll make on that is look down the road further. The $30,000 house is likely going to be worth $30,000 in 5 years from now, maybe $35,000, maybe $32,000, maybe $40,000 if the market goes crazy, right? Maybe it'll double in value in the next 10 years, though that's unlikely with those cheaper properties in the lower income areas. But let's say it doubled in value, you're now at $60,000. In 10 years of stress and headache of dealing with that property. Now, in the other side of the road, you have a nicer property. Now, I know when I say 100,000, for me, that's nice. Maybe in your area, the numbers are skewed. Maybe crappy properties are at 100 and good ones are at 300. It doesn't really matter. I'm just talking about, low end and high end. But the point is, just keep that in mind that the larger properties, the ones that are, more expensive, not larger in size, but larger in price, the more expensive properties, the nicer properties will usually appreciate better, faster, and more than the lower income areas. And so that's another reason why I generally I look for the little bit nicer areas, especially when we're talking about single family houses. So hopefully that makes sense. I know I could probably go a lot deeper into that. Maybe we should do a whole webinar on that. Speaking of webinars, I hope you guys can sign up for my next webinar, biggerpockets.com/webinar. Hope to see you there. We do them every week, teaching cool stuff like this. And I'll talk for an hour and a half on one topic like this. So hopefully you can come to the next one. And before we get out of here, let's do today's success quote of the day. And today's quote comes to us from Calvin Coolidge. And Calvin said, "Nothing in this world can take the place of persistence. Talent will not. Nothing is more common in this world than an unsuccessful man with talent. Genius will not, because unrewarded genius is almost a proverb. Education will not. The world is full of educated derelicts. Persistence and determination alone are omnipotent." And with that, let's get out of here. And remember, in pursuit of your dreams, don't just learn, but take action. For the Ask BP podcast, my name is Brandon, signing off.
You've just heard another episode of the BiggerPockets Ask BP podcast. Submit your question today on Facebook, Twitter, or the BiggerPockets forum by using hashtag AskBP. And for more incredible real estate investing tools and education, including a free download of our book, The Ultimate Beginner's Guide to Real Estate Investing, head over to BiggerPockets.com and sign up for your free account today. We'll see you on the next show.